We are wrapping up Rule 5 of Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos. Rule 5 is do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Instead of exclusively talking about the rest of this chapter's weird messages, let's take this opportunity to go over all of the weird messages that this chapter had to offer. Male kids have historically been preferred over female offspring, but, sometimes it's not about a kid's sex, it's just that the parents hate the kid. Gender nonconformity is dooming us all because their parents allow them to be who they are. Only kids bully, not adults. Socialized, civilized children lead to lower crime rates. You can use the Peterson version of operant conditioning to get kids to do what you want, but only to a certain point. Physical discipline for your child is A-OK, and now has been redefined to include timeouts because of... Remember from the previous rules that everybody is awful and broken, and as such, a family needs to have two parents in order to not resent the child. Following this advice will mean that your child will be magically just loved and adored by all they come into contact with, and as with the previous parts for this chapter, parents need to discipline their children, although exactly what discipline means isn't ever really defined, and Peterson is the best parent. Welcome back to the channel. It is another video about Peterson and parenting, the last one, thankfully. I can't wait to be over this chapter in particular. It's been rough. And channel news, we have hit 1,000 subscribers, so to everybody who is subscribed, thank you so much. More tools to play with on the back end and complain about the bad interface design. Also, we had our first Patreon live stream, so if you're interested in that sort of thing, there will be more to come. For information, check out Patreon. Links in description box below. Yeah. And here's a refresher on the different visual looks or cues I used to indicate different trains of thought in this video. So this means that we are talking straight out the horse's mouth. Peterson, book, you got it. My thoughts, science. Also, I used the book's section names to break up the video, so that's where those strangely named things are coming from periodically. Alrighty. You ready for this? Peterson says that you should try to limit the number of rules that you have with your children, because if you have too many rules, that will frustrate them. And also if you have too many rules, the odds of some bad rules existing increases, so keep the number down and you'll be more likely to have good rules. This is punishment principle number 1. Don't have too many rules. Figuring out what to do when a rule is broken is hard to establish in a context-dependent manner.
However, a helpful norm has already been enshrined in English common law, one of the great products of Western civilization.
Oh boy, I am not a lawyer, so this is gonna be fun. Wikipedia, Esquire, says that common law is very dependent on precedent. So precedent, meaning that whatever was decided by a judge at some point is what everybody else is going to roll with. You can contrast that against civil law. Civil law doesn't really use precedent. Instead, you just have your laws, which are codified rules, and a judge will use these rules and laws and whatever to decide each case individually. So it doesn't matter what judges did previously, what is going on in this particular instance and what is the outcome. Wikipedia also has a map of what country is using which system, which is on screen now, so you can see the huge impact English common law has had in the West. So I was looking into this a little bit further to try to understand it and ended up looking at common law offenses. And apparently, Canada just did away with common law offenses, and England and Wales are working on ditching them because
Common law offences were seen as unacceptably vague and open to development by the courts in ways that might offend the principle of certainty.
But the stuff that they need to have in place to be able to switch over hasn't happened yet, so they're still using common law for now. The US is a little not straightforward here. So the Supreme Court ruled that common law offenses cannot be enforced in the federal court, and there's variability between states on how this works. Some states have done away with common law offenses, like New Jersey. Other states still use common law, like Michigan. So I guess this is part of why you really need to take the bar exam for every state that you're going to be practicing in as a lawyer. Okay, so Peterson says that English common law allows you to defend your rights, but only in a reasonable manner. His example for this is somebody breaking into your house and you're armed with a loaded weapon, as opposed to a bear. I don't know. So the way this story goes down in his example is, there's an intruder. You say, hey, person who's here, I'm armed. I want you gone. And the person continues to advance. So then you fire a warning shot, presumably into the wall or ground or something. Person continues to advance. So then you fire a warning shot into their leg, with the fun caveat that this is just an example, not actual legal advice. And I guess Canadian breaking and entering guys will just stop there because that's where the example stops. This gradual escalation that Peterson talked about here is probably to be able to justify the force used at a trial. So under English common law, you have to justify the force that you used to a jury. And that's a lot harder to do if you just open by going Dirty Harry on a guy instead of ramping up the escalation. This leads us to the second punishment principle, which is to use the minimum force necessary in rule enforcement. Never forget, dear viewer, that we are having this discussion while talking about raising kids. Back to the first punishment principle, Peterson has a suggested list of rules for your kids. I'll just include the lot of them, but I will format it into a list so that it's a little bit more readable.
Do not bite, kick, or hit except in self-defense. Do not torture and bully other children so you don't end up in jail. Eat in a civilized and thoughtful manner so that people are happy to have you at their house and pleased to feed you. Learn to share so other kids will play with you. Pay attention when spoken to by adults so they don't hate you and might therefore deign to teach you something. Go to sleep properly and peaceably so that your parents can have a private life and not resent your existence. Take care of your belongings because you need to learn how and because you're lucky to have them. Be good company when something fun is happening so that you're invited for the fun. Act so that other people are happy you're around so that people will want you around. A child who knows about these rules will be welcome everywhere.
Where to start? Okay. A lot of these rules seem redundant. So 1, 2, 4, 5, 8, and 9 could arguably all be subclasses of the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. You wouldn't like to be punched or kicked or bitten, so don't do that to other people. You wouldn't like to be bullied or tortured, so don't do that to other people. So much for the minimum number of rules. Also, what does this have to do with English common law? I'm in a bit of a quandary about 2. I'm not sure if the "so you don't end up in jail" means this is meant to be broader advice, or if he's trying to actually be a little bit age appropriate here. Let's take a sojourn into developmental psychology. A researcher by the name of Kohlberg had a stage theory of moral development. Moral development meaning the cognitive processes involved in figuring out right from wrong behaviors. In this theory, early kids, so about 9 years old, will obey rules to either avoid punishment or to gain reward. After that, usually developed by adolescence, kids will mature and understand a little bit about how other people work and not just themselves, and they will shift from just doing it for punishment or reward and obeying rules or laws because they are rules or laws. After that, kids develop more from teens into adulthood, and at this point, some, not all necessarily, but at least some adults will sort of work out their own moral code that they will live by. So they'll follow their ethical and moral code and do what they feel is right, rather than because the government or the church told them what to do. So Peterson adding that "so you don't go to jail" thing might be indicative of targeting for pre-conventional or maybe conventional morality, including the punishment aspect for what happens when you bully or, I can't believe it, in this, torture other kids makes sense. On the other hand, kids have to fuck up royally to go to jail. On the other hand, I'd like to think that kids' behavior could be guided or shaped without the threat of jail. On the other hand, a not insignificant amount of people think that life would just be all murder and chaos and mayhem if we didn't have the Bible's 10 Commandments. So maybe my idealism is misplaced. I could nitpick every rule, but instead, let's take a step back. Look at the rule forest as a whole. The focus locus for most of these rules are external to the child. These rules aren't encouraging behavior for the sake of the child or the well-being internally of the child. It's so that the other kids won't hate them or that other adults won't resent them. And growing up from an attitude like that into an adult with that external focus is kind of unhealthy. Finally, one nitpick I will indulge in is on 5. So if you remember from part 2, the adultism paper, this really reminded me of that. You must listen to any and all adults because they're adults and you're just a kid. Back to the second punishment principle now. The minimum necessary force that you have to use with your kids needs to be figured out on a child-by-child basis. So, more like civil law than common law. Got it.
Some children will be turned to stone by a glare. A verbal command will stop another. A thumb-cocked flick of the index finger on a small hand might be necessary for some. Such a strategy is particularly useful in public places, such as restaurants. It can be administered suddenly, quietly, and effectively without risking escalation. What's the alternative? A child who is crying angrily, demanding attention, is not making himself popular.
In my observational experience, flicking a child in response to an undesired behavior or more involved forms of physical discipline rarely ended up with a child who is suddenly chipper and compliant and not doing what you don't want them to. Typically, it resulted in the escalation that the parent was trying to avoid. In my experience as a child, any sort of "don't make a scene" correction from my mom resulted in a scene that she was trying to avoid. Funny example is sometimes at church, my dad would let it rip. Just a fart would escape from his bowels on the wooden pew, it would make noise, and then I would get the giggles, without fail. And this would mortify my mom. So she would turn to me, shh. So it was a very pronounced shh. It became known in our household as the duck face. This was pre-selfies with that. So she would do the duck face. It would make my laughing a million times worse. Sorry. My dad would start laughing. My mom would be duck-facing, shushing both of us. And, there were a couple times when I was older that I had to just excuse myself and just laugh in the bathroom. It was so bad. But because of that escalation and the correction of trying to get me to stop laughing, and then it just made it worse. The parenting advice I've typically read on the Reddit La Chancla stuff I talked about on the last video is when a kid's having a meltdown, remove them from that situation, put them basically in timeout, quiet place for them to calm down, collect themselves, and when they are calm, have a little bit of a chat with them, and then re-engage them in whatever the situation was. Why might a child be demanding attention in a restaurant? Maybe because they want attention? And granted, most of my experience comes from cats and dogs, but something I've never understood is some people's unwillingness to try to take the other person or animal's perspective to try to figure out why they're behaving like they are. Why is the kid having a meltdown in the restaurant? Well, maybe the high chair is uncomfortable. Maybe because they've been ignored for the past half hour. Maybe they've sat quietly, they've been a good child, but they're at their limit. They need to go, they need to not be sitting there anymore. And they're communicating that. Why is the dog chewing up your shoes when you leave the house? Maybe they have separation anxiety. Maybe they have too much energy and it's just bottled up. Maybe you play with them with your shoes normally as like, oh, that's so cute. And so the dog thinks that this is an acceptable play item when really your behavior could be more consistent. Why does the cat beg for food whenever you're eating? Maybe it's because you always feed the cat when you're eating and then complain about it. Maybe. Moving on. Some more Peterson is the best parent, with talking about him and his family when his children were little, going out to restaurants and his kids being loved and adored by everybody because they were so well behaved and it was such a happy family. And he includes that on these visits, they would try to keep the time at the table as short as they could, and mention that if the kids started getting restless or fidgety, they knew it was time to leave because the kids were at their limit of sitting still. This isn't really included as advice the way it's written, it's more of an afterthought. And I'm sure that when they were leaving, everybody stood up and clapped because it was such a wonderful family.
To ensure that people respond positively to your children in public, you have to discipline your children carefully and effectively. And to do that, you have to know something about reward and about punishment, instead of shying away from that knowledge.
Oh boy, here we go. This is why I spent the time in the last video going over operant conditioning. Quick recap. Reinforcers, which can include rewards, increase the likelihood of a behavior happening. Punishment decreases the likelihood of a behavior. Punishment can only tell an organism what not to do. It can't really tell it what it should be doing. And in general, reinforcement is more effective than punishment.
Part of establishing a relationship with your son or daughter is learning how that small person responds to disciplinary intervention, and then intervening effectively. It's very easy to mouth cliches instead, such as, "There is no excuse for physical punishment," or, "Hitting children merely teaches them to hit."
Let's take a moment here before getting to the thing that's been dangling over this entire chapter like a sword of Damocles. Peterson's next move is going to be to try to discredit the not using corporal punishment idea that's gained traction. So, let's talk about the research behind the idea of not using physical discipline on or with your child. Or dogs, as the case may be. The American Academy of Pediatrics is a professional organization made up of qualified pediatricians with the goal of setting standards for treatment and helping make sure that practicing pediatricians are up to date on the field. One way to do this is to have policy statements that are basically standards for care that are empirically based. And basically, these are almost like review papers that have a takeaway message for practitioners at the end. There is a policy statement for the effective discipline to raise healthy children, and this is what we're going to be focusing on here today. All right, so let's begin with a little bit of background. In 1989, the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child pushed for member states to ban corporal punishment of children. In 2006, the UN adopted the definition for spanking and corporal punishment that was written by the Global Initiative to End All Corporal Punishment of Children, and this definition includes a really critical point that any punishment in which physical force issued and intended to cause some degree of pain or discomfort, however light, counts as spanking and corporal punishment. Some things that fall under corporal punishment are more mainstream and others are a bit more horrifying. They include hitting, involving smacking, slapping, or spanking with the hand or with something, kicking, shaking, or throwing the child, scratching, pinching, biting, or pulling hair, forcing kids to stay in uncomfortable positions, burning or scalding, forced ingestion, the old trope of cleaning a kid's mouth out with soap or apparently making them eat something spicy, Non-physical punishments that are basically verbal or emotional abuse are also included. So these include things like humiliation, denigration, scapegoating, ridicule, or threats. In the AAP policy statement, they define corporal punishment as non-injurious, open-handed hitting with the intention of modifying child behavior. They also basically go with the previous definition of verbal abuse. And now, a brief summary of the different points of the policy. First, corporal punishment doesn't really work that well in getting undesired behaviors to stop. Second, using physical discipline on your child is associated with your child being more aggressive or defiant, either towards you or others in the future. Third, using physical discipline on your child can really mess up your relationship with them. Fourth, you could actually physically hurt your child. Fifth, use of physical discipline on a child is associated with a greater incidence of psychological disorders or other cognitive impairments. Finally, the use of physical discipline on a child is associated with the child having reduced prefrontal cortical gray matter volume, a hit to their IQ, and increased cortisol levels, which is associated with a higher level of stress. So that's my position, the not hitting your kid's position. Back to Peterson.
Let's start with the former claim. There is no excuse for physical punishment.
His counter to this comes in 5 stages. 1. As a society, we can probably all agree that some forms of misbehavior are bad. His examples in text are assault and theft. And because these behaviors are bad, they should be subject to sanction. 2. Peterson claims that all sanction includes the use of physical or psychological punishment.
Deprivation of liberty causes pain in a manner essentially similar to that of physical trauma. The same can be said of the use of social isolation, including timeout. We know this neurobiologically. The same brain areas mediate response to all 3, and all are ameliorated by the same class of drugs, opiates. Jail is clearly physical punishment, particularly solitary confinement, even when nothing violent happens.
A clarification point before moving forward. When I throw up a citation needed on one of his quotes, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm disagreeing with him. It just means he's saying a statement that is strong and sort of acting as a scientific truth, and to do that, you need to have empirical evidence behind it, which means you need to have a citation there. If you haven't had the distinct pleasure of going through this process, something that gets drilled into you in learning how to write scientifically is whenever you make an argument or a claim, you need to be able to back that up. And you do that when you make that claim or argument. There is some art to doing this well, though. When it's done well, the extensions feel like an extension of whatever the thought was, and you don't really notice them being there. If it's done poorly, you notice them being there, they're intrusions, or you have to play connect the thoughts to figure out what reference was tied to what thought, or there's just not references for things. Ugh, Pierce! Ugh, God! Weird, something in my throat. Alright, commence the teardown. I'm having a hard time finding a paper that basically sets the equivalency between a loss of freedom and experiencing physical pain, but I admit that I could well be using the wrong search terms to get the results to pop out. It does happen from time to time. You don't use the right keywords and Google Scholar just, nope, there's nothing. I did find one talking about the figurative pains of being on probation, and the chief issue there was the lack of autonomy that you experience. Another paper I found was talking about spatial pains of imprisonment, and focused on how the prisons design, especially modern prisons with how sterile and kind of safe they are, kind of gives prisoners a psychic prison as well as just a physical iron cage to exist in. Final example. In some work out of Canada, the researcher was looking at one particular correctional facility where people were being held pre-trial, so they hadn't been convicted of anything yet. That was going to happen in the future. And this researcher found that these people were experiencing some psychological and physical harm from being in prison. And the themes that they were reporting were issues of warehouse living, so having lots of people shoved in small spaces and the consequences of that, power dynamics between the prisoners and the guard, Zimbardo anyone, insufficient health care, and this is something I saw reported elsewhere, that prisoners really have to fight to have adequate medical coverage. And finally, just general health damage that happened as a result of being in prison. Looking into social isolation in a penal or prison setting means we're talking about solitary confinement. And I'm pulling together from this language that Peterson is saying that solitary confinement is equivalent to experiencing physical trauma. And we'll loop back to solitary confinement and its relationship to timeouts for kids. So just put a pin in that for right now. The research on the effects of solitary confinement paint a very bleak picture for its use. Solitary confinement has been described by one researcher as a mental health hazard because people go into solitary confinement and a lot of them will develop depression, adjustment disorders, or even have a psychotic break in there. I'll just quote this paper because why are we doing this to people? The restriction of environmental stimulation and social isolation associated with confinement in solitary are strikingly toxic to mental functioning, producing a stuporous condition associated with perceptual and cognitive impairment and affective disturbances. In more severe cases, inmates so confined have developed florid delirium, a confusional psychosis with intense agitation, fearfulness, and disorganization. But even those inmates who are more psychologically resilient inevitably suffer severe psychological pain as a result of such confinement, especially when the confinement is prolonged, and especially when the individual experiences this confinement as being the product of an arbitrary exercise of power and intimidation. Moreover, the harm caused by such confinement may result in prolonged or permanent psychiatric disability, including impairments which may seriously reduce the inmate's capacity to reintegrate into the broader community upon release from prison. The authors do note that those who tend to end up in solitary confinement are usually a hazard to themselves, other prisoners, even the guards. But they highlight that most of these people are impulsive and unstable, not like the cold, calculating, manipulative type. The implication kind of being here that if we could get them stable and get their impulsiveness under control, they wouldn't need to go into solitary confinement anymore. I could go on. If this was a paper, this would be where you would see a huge blob of references supporting this argument that I'm making, because there is a lot of support for this argument that I'm making. That solitary confinement is harmful. Cruel, even. The last thing I'll say here is that solitary confinement, at least the way it's done in the US and other parts of the world, is absolutely not the same thing as a child being put in timeout. If solitary confinement was more like timeout, where it was just a temporary thing while a person calmed down, then we could talk equivalencies. But solitary confinement, as it is used, in the US at least, is a form of punishment for bad behavior in some way or just pissing off the wrong person, and it doesn't just last until the person calms down. It goes on for days or weeks or months or years, and that's where a lot of the research is pointing to the harmful effects of. I think this comes down to what you're hoping to get out of the solitary confinement or the timeout. Do you want rehabilitation or do you want punishment? For illustrative purposes, let's say you've got a kid who wants to eat all of their Halloween candy on Halloween night. You tell them no, and now they are having a meltdown. If your goal is to punish the child, then sure, put them in timeout, and at some point later, they come out of timeout. But if you want to rehabilitate the behavior, yeah, you still put your kid in timeout, but make sure that they know that they're there to calm down. When they're calm, you basically go have a debrief with them. Talk with them, ask them what they were feeling, see if you can help them come up with different strategies to deal with those feelings, so if it happens again in the future, maybe it won't go into a meltdown. Maybe have a discussion about candy being a sometimes food and broader nutrition stuff. Talk with them. Share with them why you're telling them no on this, and maybe they'll be able to understand and apply that to things in the future so you don't constantly have to just be disciplining your child. The big reference I could find for neurobiological is basically finding that people who are in solitary confinement have similar changes in brain activity to those who are undergoing sensory deprivation. Reference 105 is a 1998 book. From the description of it, it seems like a kind of pop science book that is trying to talk about the substrates of emotion for non-specialists. Let's talk about the opiates in an educational and not glorifying manner. Opiates are drugs with a similar chemical makeup to drugs that are derived from opium. So processing-wise, we had opium, which was from the poppy plants, and then you refine that a little bit and you get morphine. You refine that further, and one of the things you can get is heroin. So if it's similar to that stuff, it's an opiate. Briefly, opiates work by having the same binding shape as some neurotransmitters naturally found in the body, specifically the endorphins. Trivia. The name endorphin is actually a portmanteau of endogenous and morphine. Pooh, you get endorphin. So people knew that morphine worked, and at some point the question became how, when science montage later and endorphins were discovered. You know what the opiates do other than Peterson's claim of making social isolation, physical trauma, and loss of freedom less shitty? Pain management. And maybe this is the point he's kind of trying to make all along here, but I kind of doubt it. Other general uses of the opiates. Well, for one thing, it's great at suppressing coughs. So some cough syrups that you buy is also what people use to make lean or scissor or whatever else you kids are calling it these days. You kids with your lean. Anyways, the cough syrup contains codeine, which, given the context I just gave you, does have psychoactive or wee effects, especially in the presence of another ingredient in the cough syrup. But another use of the opiates, or some opiates, is in stopping diarrhea. Imodium AD is an opiate. It doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, but it's still an opiate. So by this logic, does that mean that diarrhea is equivalent to a loss of freedom and physical trauma and social isolation? Although, if you're peeing out your butt, you are probably going to be a bit socially isolated and will experience some loss of freedom. But anyways, to Peterson, jail is physical punishment. Should it be, though? Note the progression here. Jail is physical punishment, especially solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is equivalent to timeouts for kids, therefore, timeouts for kids are physical punishment. I don't know what his intent is here, only he does. But I think the case could be made that he's trying to get parents who are already using timeouts to get on board with this idea that because they're already using timeouts, they're already using physical discipline, and they're already using physical discipline, so why not use a more effective form of it? 3.
Some misbegotten actions must be brought to a halt both effectively and immediately, not least so that something worse doesn't happen. What's the proper punishment for someone who will not stop poking a fork into an electrical socket? Or who runs away laughing in a crowded supermarket parking lot? The answer is simple. Whatever will stop it the fastest, within reason, because the alternative could be fatal.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep the little one from harming themselves in the moment. But then do that perspective shift that I was talking about earlier. Why is the kid forking the socket? Well, I mean, if you look at a fork, it kind of looks like it should go in the socket. And kids have those games where you have the triangle peg that goes in the triangle hole, the round peg goes in the round hole, the slanty peg goes in the slanty hole. Or maybe it's just curiosity. I wonder what will happen if I do this. How do you get your little junior electrician to stop? Well, if they're old enough to have a talk with them about electrocution. You don't have to go into gory detail, but you can get them to understand that being shocked is not fun. And if they're not old enough to have that talk with, buy those stupid plug covers of some form. Yeah, they're a little inconvenient, but it's better than having a shocked kid. Why is the kid laughing while running away in a parking lot? I think the laughter is a huge hint here. That means the kid probably thinks this is a game. Maybe you've chased your kid around the house or a park before and like, tee-hee-hee, I'm gonna get you. And it's fun. And for whatever reason, the kid thinks that now in the parking lot is a good time to play that game. In this case, try to teach the kid the importance of time and place for hijinks. Emphasize the importance of staying near the parent when you're in a public place, especially where there's moving vehicles. Reinforce the behaviors you want to see. Thank them for staying near you, like when you're in the shopping center or mall or wherever you are. Thank them, and if you need to bribe them, like on the way out to the car with a cart, hey, I bet you can't keep both hands, on the cart the entire way to the car. If I'm wrong, this piece of candy is all yours. Make it a game. Make it a different type of game. Granted, in both these cases, you should absolutely stop your child before they have a chance to hurt themselves. Like, if they're running out into traffic, grab them. But there is a huge difference between grabbing your kid's arm and, oh my gosh, please don't run out into traffic like that. That's so dangerous. You have me so worried. And, no, don't do that. 4.
To unthinkingly parrot the magic line, "There is no excuse for physical punishment," is also to foster the delusion that teenage devils magically emerge from once innocent little child angels. You're not doing your child any favors by overlooking any misbehavior, particularly if he or she is temperamentally more aggressive.
In the lead up to point 4, Peterson says that the kids who aren't socialized by age 4 are the ones who are problematic later in life. Also, the troubled kids at age 4 are the aggressive kids at age 2. His reference here is 105, and I'll put it on screen. And I'm guessing from reading it, this is where he got most of his information for the ages and socialization stuff from. But this paper does more than just talk about the incidence rates of aggressive behavior in kids or the developmental trajectories of those aggressive kids. It talks about predictors of aggressive behavior that are present when the child is born. So even before the kid has any experience with the world independent from its mother's womb, there are predictors for future aggressive behavior. And these include having young siblings, having moms who themselves were or are aggressive, having a mom who started having children when she was young, the mother smoking during pregnancy, or having a low income. Predictors for aggressive behavior when the child is at 5 months old include coercive parenting strategies, meaning the tendency to respond in a negative and restrictive manner to the child, and a dysfunctional family. So some of the predictive factors for having an aggressive child are basically having an aggressive parent. And this meshes with some of the sources that the AAP policy statement used. 5. Using the word no effectively requires that there be an underlying threat of punishment.
A woman can say no to a powerful, narcissistic man only because she has social norms, the law, and the state backing her up.
Fuck off. Maybe some of what he said is true some of the time, but he makes it sound so trivial for a woman in a toxic relationship at best to be able to tell this type of guy no. And if you've seen Lily's story on this channel, you may remember that her ex is a cop. And he wasn't the worst person on that police department by far. Peterson says that a parent saying no only works because of the size, strength, and cognitive differences between the parent and the children. I guess that's why you have to assert your dominance over your lobster babies early and often. Or you can have a relationship built on trust and respect, and no from a parent in that situation means that the parent is trying to help the child act in their own best interest. Let's say there are cupcakes around, but it's dinner time, and your little kiddo wants one of those cupcakes now, before dinner. There's a couple approaches you can take. One, all right, you can have a cupcake after dinner. You have to wait. Scoot. Another approach is, okay, why is it cupcake time? Convince me. Maybe the kid can come up with a compelling argument for why it is cupcake time, and you go with it. Or maybe you have a little bit of a back and forth debate about cupcakes, and this does take a little bit more prep work than because I said so, but you're helping your kid develop analytical skills here. Peterson ends the fifth thought by saying that a no without threat behind it only works between civilized people. The other cliche is,
hitting a child merely teaches them to hit.
here's where we finally get to the explicit discussion of corporal punishment as physical punishment. And this is a behemoth of a quote, but I do not want to paraphrase or lighten or lessen anything of what's said.
First, no. Wrong. Too simple. For starters, hitting is a very unsophisticated word to describe the disciplinary act of an effective parent. If hitting accurately described the entire range of physical force, then there would be no difference between rain droplets and atomic bombs. Magnitude matters, and so does context, if we're not being willfully blind and naive about the issue. How hard someone is hit and why they are hit cannot merely be ignored when speaking of hitting. Timing, part of context, is also of crucial importance. If you flick your 2-year-old with your finger, just after he smacks the baby on the head with a wooden block, he will get the connection, and be at least somewhat less willing to smack her again in the future. That seems like a good outcome. He certainly won't conclude that he should hit her more, using the flick of his mother's finger as an example. He's not stupid. He's just jealous, impulsive, and not very sophisticated. And how else are you going to protect his younger sibling? If you discipline ineffectively, then the baby will suffer, maybe for years. The bullying will continue because you won't do a damn thing to stop it. You'll avoid the conflict that's necessary to establish peace. You'll turn a blind eye. And then later, when the younger child confronts you, maybe even in adulthood, you'll say, I never knew it was like that. You just didn't want to know. So, you didn't. You just rejected the responsibility of discipline and justified it with a continual show of your niceness. Every gingerbread house has a witch inside that devours children.
So much, so much. In a experiment for a topic for another day, there was a memory experiment that found that the word used to describe a car accident, so hit or crash or smash, the violence of the word used altered people's memory for that car crash. So the more dramatic and violent the word that was used, the more violent and dramatic people remembered the accident being. So Peterson sort of arguing about words used here kind of feels like he's trying to do a little bit of narrative control. And honestly, hit seems like a pretty low end as far as graphicness goes for describing the full range of corporal punishments. So the cliche is hitting begets hitting, and instead of addressing that cliche, he just goes on to talk about how to flick your kid effectively. Is this because the research is on the side of hitting begets hitting? The timing context. To some extent, the child will learn something. They will learn not to do that behavior in front of the parent. So it's not just the timing, it's a much more broad context that the kid or adults will pick up on. Be honest with yourself. How closely do you abide by the posted speed laws when there's not police present? How else protect the sibling? Well, if the kid isn't old enough to have a talk with, maybe not have hard things that can be used as weapons against their younger sibling. If they're old enough, have a talk with them. Peterson is sort of right. Kids typically aren't stupid, so talk with them. Put it in a context that they can understand. It's going to take a bit longer than just flicking them, but you can get out why they did that behavior, what behaviors you would like to see from them, maybe even just how would you like it if your older sibling hit you in the head with something hard. Linking this back to the reinforcement versus punishment stuff, punishing them with the flick doesn't really teach the kid anything other than bash baby with block equals flick from parent when parent present, but it doesn't get at the underlying issue. If you talk with the kid and the kid is able to talk back, you can find out if this is a jealousy issue and maybe do something to nip it in the bud now. Does Peterson honestly think that this flick will cure all jealousy issues the kid has? Actually, I guess he kind of does. Although I do agree that ineffective discipline and correction will result in future suffering down the road. Just Peterson and I drastically differ on what effective and discipline mean. So I guess if you aren't physically disciplining your child, you're not disciplining them at all. Good to see we're redefining words today. As if responding to my criticism, Peterson says that our choice, our only choice, is between whether or not to discipline effectively or ineffectively. Science be damned. Peterson includes some discipline hints. So the first one goes from, wow, this is actually pretty reasonable advice. Where is this person writing this been hiding this whole time? To, okay, yeah, nope. That's more like the book I've come to expect. So this advice starts off with using timeout to help your child recover from some form of emotional meltdown. Not bad advice. Again, what I've read and said before, you get the kid in a quiet place for them to calm down. When they are calm, praise them for doing so, have a little bit of talk, try to get to a place where maybe it won't happen again, blah, blah, blah. The Petersoning. When the child comes out of timeout, you'll like him again. I guess this fits with the chapter's title, but ugh. He continues on to say that you might have to physically restrain your child in timeout, and if your kid's still fighting it at that point, time for a spanking. And then he says that sometimes even a spanking isn't enough, but then doesn't say what the next course of action is. So, top-notch parenting advice, Peterson. Peterson rehashes the first two punishment principles. 1, thou shalt limit thy number of rules. 2, thy must use the minimum force required gist of the situation. The third punishment principle is that
parents should come in pairs.
107 is a reference dump that can basically be boiled down to some behavioral measures and some outcomes being negatively affected by the parents divorcing when there's a child. But there's a common theme of, there's some negative effects of divorce, but these can be mitigated or lessened if preventative measures are taken. Also, to point out, being in a dysfunctional family with two parents will still fuck with you. So maybe it isn't necessarily that this family got divorced that's the issue, but the dysfunction leading to the divorce that was the problem. One of the references that Peterson cites even says this. His justification for this principle is that parenting is hard, which it is, and as such, it might leave you not in your best form, you might say, and so you need an accountability buddy to make sure you don't abuse your kids. Then he makes a kind of half-hearted, but much respect to the single moms who are doing it by themselves, it's really hard and whatever, but then says that doesn't mean we should pretend that all family forms are equally viable. They're not. Period. Punishment principle number 4.
Parents should understand their own capacity to be harsh, vengeful, arrogant, resentful, angry, and deceitful.
The phrasing could be better here, but okay, yeah. It's good to take inventory and know the pernicious parts of your personality before going into parenting, but then there's always a but here, isn't there? People are both good and evil. No one sets out to be a bad parent, but
no adult human being No hierarchical predatory ape can truly tolerate being dominated by an upstart child.
You serious?
Peterson says that revenge will come for this threat to dominance, and it will be born out of resentment, and several steps later basically will result in the parent and the children hating each other. Peterson says that it's good to have a disciplined game plan in place before the bad behaviors happen. I agree. But then he says that toxic families are the ones who don't discipline their kids. I will refer you to my advertiser unfriendly video on the phenomenon of golden children to support my nuh-uh here. But briefly, some very toxic families have too much discipline that is applied very inconsistently. Punishment principle number 5.
Parents have a duty to act as proxies for the real world. This obligation supersedes any responsibility to ensure happiness, foster creativity, or boost self-esteem. It is the primary duty of parents to make their children socially desirable. This will provide the child with opportunity, self-regard, and security. It's more important even than fostering individual identity.
Again, he's putting the focus on external sources. Instead of raising your child well because it's what's best for them, raise them well because what will the neighbors think? If you follow his parenting advice, he says that you will have this great, wonderful kid who has great boundaries, somehow, and they will be loved everywhere they go, they will be welcomed, they will be wanted, and it will just be sunshine, rainbows, unicorns, just the best. And it will all be because you didn't not discipline your child. He says to work out what behaviors you do and don't like, and then take this list, I guess, to another adult to see if you're being a resentful chaos snake or if these are actually legitimate do's and don'ts of behavior. And then you make your child behave. If you don't like what your kids are doing, other people probably won't like what your kids are doing, but other people will be willing to punish your child, whereas you were too afraid or incapable of doing so. Then we transition back to some your kid is amazing because you followed this advice, everything is sunshine and rainbows, everybody claps whenever they do something, stuff. But then
clear rules and proper discipline help the child and the family and the society establish, maintain, and expand the order that is all that protects us from chaos and the terrors of the underworld, where everything is uncertain, anxiety-provoking, hopeless, and depressing. There are no greater gifts that a committed and courageous parent can bestow. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them.
As with so much in this book, surface level, well, before the order chaos stuff came back, surface level, the message wasn't bad. Consistent discipline and rules and clear expectations are really important for a child. But there's a huge difference between discipline that uses corporal punishment and discipline that doesn't. Also, it's important to think what you're trying to convey with your discipline. If a kid makes a mistake, are they going to try to learn from it, or are they going to try to hide it? So that was Peterson's parenting advice. Discipline your kids. Too bad that wasn't the only advice. Now let's go back through and consider some alternatives to the less good parenting advice that was found in this chapter. I will be skipping the tangential stuff though. If you feel like you're being dominated by your kids, take a step back, think about it for a second. Do you feel like they're walking all over you, either figuratively or literally? You need to set up some boundaries. Establish and enforce boundaries of acceptable behavior, and hopefully, over time, this will translate into your kids not dominating you anymore. Also, please, please, please do it with reinforcement if you can. Positive reinforcement, ideally. Remember, you want to indicate what behavior to do instead of just not what to do. If your kids aren't listening to you or are just ignoring your attempts at correction, figure out why. Maybe you were inconsistent on enforcing boundaries in the past, and that's what they learned to expect. If they're old enough, you are allowed to have a heart-to-heart conversation with your children or child and say that, you want to be the best parent that you can be for them, and you now realize that you were really inconsistent with boundaries and rule enforcement previously, and you're seeing the consequences of that now. You want to be a better parent for them, so how do you make that happen? How do we make that happen? Granted, some troubled kids might laugh in your face at this. And if that happens, that is a sign that things need to change. Maybe it just involves being more present in your kid's life. Maybe it involves counseling. Maybe it involves something more severe than that. But whatever it is, you have to be prepared for the idea that your child needs to change, but you're going to have to change as well. Diversity and people living their truth are good things. And people of any gender identity really could come from overly permissive parents or overly strict parents. I mean, there's plenty of examples all over the spectrum of parenting styles. Yes, it was a good thing to liberalize the divorce laws. Now we need to get better as a society in providing the pre- and post-divorce support to help lessen the impact of the divorce itself. Be a parent first, and a friend second. Not because, oh my god, discipline, or what will the neighbors think if I'm not smacking my child. Do it because your kid needs to have an adult who is unconditionally on their side, but will also call them on their bullshit. Kids need to learn from an adult in their life, hopefully a parent, about the world, life, how to love and be lovable, and also just be productive in society. Let your kids reach their milestones when they're ready to. I mean, it is good to encourage your child to try new things or to push their limits, but it's also important to leave room for failure and use that as a learning opportunity. Don't just rip the spoon from your child's mouth. Let the little eager eater try. Get the food going, get the spoon going, build his confidence, get the serotonin flowing or whatever. Let him make the mess. It's kids. And feed him until he's able to feed himself. Duh. In case you forgot, Peterson hates Elmo with a burning, fiery passion. Not everything is about dominance. A kid testing boundaries isn't vying for position at the top of the local hierarchy. Kids are little people. They are just as deserving of respect and compassion and love as adults. Let them be who they are and not who you want them to be. Part of establishing a relationship with your child is learning who they are. If they want to be a dinosaur today, let them be a dinosaur today. Families come in all kinds of sizes and all kinds of configurations, and that's okay. It'd be nice if we had more social support for single parents who are struggling, but acceptance comes first, I guess. Please don't hit your kids. Peterson says that not disciplining your kids is easier than disciplining them, but using corporal punishment on your kids is easier than doing the hard talks and conversations with your child and teaching them what is right, instead of just teaching them what is wrong. Something that Peterson doesn't touch on, but I will, is just acknowledgement that having a kid with some form of developmental disability or other psychological disorder is parenting on hard mode. The parenting strategies for normal or easy mode don't necessarily work when you're dealing with hard mode. A meltdown for a neurotypical, happy, healthy, average child, what you do is drastically different than what you have to do if a child with autism is having a meltdown. Completely different strategy and skill set there. One-size-fits-all parenting advice is almost always going to exclude somebody unless we're talking about something like make sure your kid has enough air to breathe. If you are playing the parenting game on hard mode, you're doing amazing work. There's no shame in it. And if you haven't found some online community or support group for it, I can almost guarantee there's one out there. You don't have to reinvent the parenting wheel with this and go it alone. There are other people going through what you are, and I'm sure that they'd be more than happy to share their tips. Finally, hopefully, you have had good boundaries with your child. They respect you, you respect them. They can be who they are. You have a good relationship with your kid. Having a good relationship that's built on that respect and trust is so important as a parent and as a child. It is much more difficult if a child doesn't think that they can go to their parent with everything. Bad things can continue to happen for longer periods of time than they need to if a child doesn't think that they can go to their parent to stop the situation. And on that bombshell, it's time for the end of Rule 5. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. So, Peterson vacation time. Like if you enjoyed it, comment with anything in the description box. You can always hit me up on Twitter, Patreon. I'm forgetting things. Description box knows more than me right now. See you guys in the next video. Bye.